The Pacific sky cracked open like a wound. Rain hammered the tin roofs of the Okinawa POW camp, drowning every other sound. Floodlights sliced through the downpour, catching the trembling faces of captured Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and communication aides, their uniforms long turned to rags. A U.S. guard stepped forward, voice cutting through the storm, "Stand in the rain, and don't blink." The order wasn't shouted, it was spoken like a verdict. For a second, even the thunder seemed to hesitate. Rows of women stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud, eyes wide, unblinking, trying to make sense of a punishment that felt like madness. Each droplet stung like cold glass. These were soldiers who'd been trained to die for the emperor, not to stand still under American eyes. Reports indicate around 3,500 Japanese POW were scattered across the Pacific by 1945, but fewer than 5% were women. And tonight, that tiny fraction stood frozen beneath a tropical sky that wanted to swallow them whole. The guards didn't laugh, they didn't threaten, they simply watched. This wasn't about violence. It was about control, endurance, breaking the invisible armor of obedience. Rain rolled down faces like tears no one would admit were real. Somewhere behind the fence, diesel engines hummed, tents flapped, and the American flag snapped wetly in the wind. Inside one barrack, someone whispered, "Why make them do this?" The sergeant beside him answered, "Orders from above, psychological test." But out there, in the storm, it didn't feel like a test. It felt like time itself was punishing them. For the prisoners, the rain became a battlefield, no weapons, no glory, only the ache of standing. One woman blinked. A guard marked it down on a clipboard. No one knew what would come next. Somewhere in the darkness, a voice murmured, "Even the sky is against us now." The camera would linger on one prisoner, in particular Lieutenant Yumi Takahashi, a field nurse with a scar under her left eye. Her lashes trembled, rain streaming down her cheeks. She was breathing hard, heart pounding against soaked cotton, trying not to blink. The spotlight shifted, catching her face. For her, this was no longer about obedience, it was about survival. And as her vision began to blur, she heard boots crunching closer through the mud. Lieutenant Yumi Takahashi's body shivered under the weight of the rain. Every droplet felt like a needle driving through her skin, but her eyes, those dark, sharp eyes, remained fixed on the horizon. The order still echoed in her skull, "Don't blink." The human body blinks 20 times a minute on instinct. Her will fought that reflex as if it were the enemy. Around her, the formation of women stood rigid, rain pooling in their collars, uniforms clinging to their bones. None dared move. This was no battlefield, but the fear felt the same. Her vision wavered. Water streaked down her eyelashes, merging with tears she didn't acknowledge. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her ears, every muscle screaming for release. Studies show that exposure to cold rain for just 2 hours can drop core body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius, the edge of hypothermia. But there was something colder than the rain. Shame, shame of being captured. Shame of standing powerless before men who looked at her not as a soldier, but as a subject of curiosity. "Eyes open, Takahashi," one of the guards muttered, almost under his breath. He wasn't mocking, more like testing. The stopwatch in his hand clicked once, marking each minute like a metronome of suffering. She remembered her training back in 1943. Discipline is endurance. Endurance is faith. But faith had never felt this heavy. Around her, one woman broke. A faint gasp, then a flinch. Another blinked, too long. The guard's pencil moved again. Each mark on his clipboard was invisible punishment, yet somehow worse than a whip. Yumi clenched her jaw until her teeth hurt. "We were trained for bullets. she would later write in her journal, "Not for silence." The world narrowed to the sound of rain on helmets, water trickling down boots, and the steady crunch of an approaching patrol. Her lashes fluttered once, dangerously close to closing. She dug her nails into her palms to keep focus. The guard's footsteps grew louder, closer, deliberate. She couldn't tell if he pitied her or enjoyed this ritual. Her pulse spiked. For a heartbeat, she almost blinked, and then froze as the mud behind her shifted. Someone was moving, someone coming toward her through the downpour, heavy boots dragging through the slush. The crunch of leather on wet earth grew louder, closer. The guard was here. The man approaching through the storm was Sergeant William Cole, broad shoulders, rain dripping off his helmet, eyes sharp but unreadable. He stopped 3 feet from Yumi, clipboard in one hand, stopwatch in the other. The rain made his khaki uniform cling to his frame, mud splattering his boots. He didn't shout. He simply raised the stopwatch and clicked it again. Tick. The sound was louder than thunder. He was measuring not time, but resistance. Each blink was recorded like a confession. Cole had been briefed about psychological fatigue drills, new behavioral experiments introduced by U.S. Army field manuals in late 1944. The goal was simple: to see how long human defiance could last under controlled stress. It wasn't supposed to be torture, at least not on paper. But here, under the rain, that line blurred fast. He watched the women through the mist. They looked more like statues than soldiers, silent, slick with water, barely breathing. Behind him, another guard muttered, "You sure this is regulation?" Cole didn't answer. His jaw tightened. He'd seen worse in Saipan, where surrender had been rare and suicide common. Yet something about this still felt wrong. He looked back at Yumi. Her lips trembled, not from cold but exhaustion. He clicked the stopwatch again. "You blink, you fail," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Reports indicate that these fatigue drills sometimes lasted 4 to 6 hours, though no official document ever admitted to it. The experiment's purpose, obedience through exhaustion. Yumi's eyes burned. She wanted to close them, just for a second. But her pride wouldn't let her. The sergeant's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered curiosity, maybe pity. The rainwater poured down both their faces, erasing the line between captor and captive for a fleeting moment. Then, in the background, a sound, a soft, wet thud. One of the women collapsed forward into the mud. The formation shuddered, but no one moved to help. Cole's stopwatch froze mid-click. His head turned slowly toward the fallen figure. For the first time that night, he lowered his clipboard. The order was broken, and silence cracked open like lightning. He stepped toward the woman on the ground as the rest of the line trembled, waiting for whatever came next. The fallen woman hit the mud with a sound that cut through the rain, a dull human thud. For a moment no one breathed. The formation froze, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if pretending she hadn't fallen would make it untrue. Sergeant Cole knelt, fingers pressed to her neck. She was conscious but fading, lips pale, pulse fluttering like a trapped moth. He glanced up. The corporal beside him waited for orders, rain dripping from his cap brim. Cole finally spoke, his voice low, "Get her up. Don't break formation." The corporal barked something sharp, and 2 guards moved in. The woman was lifted, her head hanging, her soaked uniform plastered to her frame. Her body swayed like a broken mast in the storm. "Stand her back," Cole ordered. "She'll warm faster upright." It wasn't true, but he needed control, not chaos. Behind him, another guard scribbled on a notepad, recording the time, roughly 1 hour, 50 minutes since the drill began. Historical records from late 1945, mention 14 Japanese women hospitalized for exposure across Okinawa POW facilities. The reports use the term disciplinary exposure incident, cold words for something brutally human. The logic had been that strict drills would build resilience, but the effect was collapse, confusion, and in some cases, permanent damage. Yumi Takahashi clenched her fists. The woman beside her was shaking uncontrollably, yet no one dared move. Falling was forbidden. Yumi would later write, even mercy was forbidden. The guards watched from under their ponchos, water dripping off rifles, faces expressionless. The storm didn't stop. It only got harder. Each raindrop sounded like static, a rhythm of control. Cole looked back at the line. No one leaves, he said quietly. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear of losing order. One broken soldier could undo the entire illusion of authority. He straightened, jaw tight, and gave a nod to the corporal. Continue. The women blinked water from their lashes, holding their gaze forward again. Mud swallowed their boots. Thunder rolled like distant artillery. Somewhere, a single cough echoed, then vanished into the rain. Cole turned his eyes toward the clipboard once more, pen trembling slightly in his hand. The next phase was about to begin, the punishment for blinking. And as the sergeant gave a single nod, a guard stepped forward, holding a metal bucket filled with freezing rainwater. The bucket hit the ground with a metallic clang, water sloshing over the rim. The guard, young, nervous, maybe 20, waited for the nod. Sergeant Cole gave it once, curt and wordless. The punishment for blinking wasn't written anywhere, but every soldier in the yard understood the ritual. The first woman to falter was forced forward. The guard dipped a tin cup into the icy bucket and threw the water across her face. It wasn't violent. It was humiliation, the kind that stripped a person of identity, molecule by molecule. Rain and bucket water blended into one relentless downpour. The women flinched, eyes wide again, instinctively fighting the reflex to close them. The rule was simple: blink and you're next. The guards called it discipline through endurance. Yumi Takahashi called it survival through madness. Each woman became a statue carved by defiance and fear, her expression set somewhere between pride and pain. Reports from Okinawa in late 1945 mention non-lethal pressure drills lasting up to 6 hours, designed to test physical and psychological compliance. But on this night, science had no meaning. This was raw, cruel theater. Cole's face stayed blank, but inside, unease was blooming like a bruise. The bucket splashed again, another blink, another punishment. The line of women shook, yet none broke rank. One of the guards muttered, "They're tougher than steel." Cole didn't respond. He was watching Yumi now. Her face was soaked, her lips trembling, yet her eyes still burned with something unbroken. That stubborn spark unsettled him. He clicked his stopwatch, 3 hours and counting. His mind registered the absurdity of it all. 3 hours in the open storm for an order that meant nothing. Yumi's knees quivered, but her stare held. Her body screamed to close her eyes, to rest, but her pride screamed louder. We stopped feeling human, she would later write. We became shapes of endurance. Every drop of rain felt like another question. What does surrender really mean if you never bow? The guards began to tire before the prisoners did. The rain showed no mercy. The ground turned to liquid earth. Yet through it all, something subtle shifted. The women began standing taller, no longer victims, but survivors in defiance. And as thunder cracked once more, a flash of lightning revealed a strange sight. The guards retreating under the awnings, while the prisoners still stood, motionless in the storm. By the 4th hour, the sky itself seemed to rebel. The rain no longer fell. It roared. Sheets of water blurred the yard into a silver haze. Floodlights flickered, drowning in their own light. The ground, once firm, had turned to a sucking swamp of mud that swallowed boots whole. Sergeant Cole shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the noise. The guards, who had once stood tall, now huddled beneath awnings, coats pulled tight, cigarettes trembling between wet fingers. Only the prisoners remained outside, silent, rigid, statues against the storm. Tropical rainfall in Okinawa could exceed 200 millimeters in a single night, and this one felt determined to break that record. The camp's drainage ditches overflowed, transforming the yard into a shallow pool. The water reached the prisoners' ankles, swirling with mud and debris. Yet none of the women moved. Even the guard dogs whined, retreating into their kennels. Cole stared out from under the awning, the absurdity hitting him like the thunder overhead. The punishment had inverted itself, the storm had turned sides. They feared the rain more than us now. One survivor would later write. And she was right. The guards weren't facing prisoners anymore. They were facing endurance itself. The line of soaked figures refused to fall. Yumi Takahashi stood at the center, her frame shaking, eyes still unblinking beneath the floodlight glare. Rain streamed down her face, tracing the scar under her eye like a signature. Inside the mess tent, an officer cursed, kicking a bucket aside. "This is pointless," he muttered, but hierarchy had its own gravity. No one dared call it off. Cole wiped his face, his fingers numb, his throat raw. He looked back at the line and felt something foreign in his chest, respect maybe, or shame. The storm blurred everything but that feeling. Lightning split the sky open again, followed by a boom that rattled the watchtower. The entire camp flickered dark for a breath. When the floodlights surged back, Cole saw Yumi still standing, still unblinking, still defiant. Behind him, a voice yelled through the storm, "Keep them standing." The words sounded less like command, more like desperation. Cole looked toward the officer who'd spoken, rain dripping from his chin, and realized the next move would come from him. Lieutenant Harris stood under the flapping canvas of the command tent, rain hammering down so hard it blurred the world outside. He was young, maybe 26, but already worn from years of orders that didn't make sense once the shooting stopped. His uniform was soaked through, his cap gone, his eyes fixed on the spectacle beyond the fence. 30 Japanese women still standing in formation, drenched and silent under a merciless sky. The absurdity of it pressed against his skull. This wasn't discipline anymore, it was theater, and he was the unwilling director. Sergeant Cole stood beside him, face pale in the flickering lamplight. "Sir," he said, voice low, "they've been out there nearly 4 hours. They're shaking bad." Harris didn't answer. He'd read the manual, the one written in neat typewriter, font back in Washington, that spoke of psychological conditioning. It didn't say what to do when the rain turned the ground into a graveyard of morale. Outside, thunder rolled across the island like a shell burst. The guards under the awnings avoided looking at the prisoners. Even they could feel the shift. The punishment no longer humbled the enemy. It humiliated everyone involved. Harris clenched his jaw. Reports from 1945 describe moral fatigue among camp officers who struggled to enforce ambiguous discipline. It was showing now in his eyes. He turned to Cole. "End it," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, Yumi Takahashi's silhouette caught his attention. She was still standing perfectly straight, her face tilted upward into the storm, eyes wide and unbroken. The floodlight behind her made her look carved from steel. For a moment, Harris hesitated. Something in her posture felt like defiance, and something in him responded to it. He stepped out into the rain, boots sinking into mud. The downpour hit his face like slaps. He moved toward the line, shouting, "Enough!" His voice cracked through the storm. But Yumi didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked ahead. Her expression neither submission nor rage, just resolve. Harris stopped in front of her, staring back. He looked at us. One survivor recalled later, not as enemies, but as something broken. For a heartbeat, the camp went still. Harris raised his hand to signal the end, but Yumi didn't blink, didn't lower her head. He realized then she wouldn't stop until she decided it was over. Lieutenant Harris stood inches away from her now, Yumi Takahashi, face streaked with rain, hair plastered to her forehead, uniform clinging to her like second skin. The floodlight behind her burned white through the storm, outlining her in ghostly light. Her lips trembled, but her eyes, they didn't move. "Not once," he shouted again. "It's over." But she didn't react to her. The order wasn't freedom. It was another test. She had spent her life obeying orders. Defiance, for the first time, felt like control. Her pulse pounded against the base of her throat. Each second stretched into eternity. Her hands, blue and trembling, were clenched tight enough to leave marks on her palms. Every nerve screamed for relief, yet she stood, because surrender wasn't the same as defeat. The Japanese Imperial Code of Honor, the one she memorized back in 1943, had been clear. A captured soldier is a dead soul. She'd broken that rule the day she was taken alive. Tonight, she was reclaiming it in her own way. Rainwater ran over her scar, into her mouth, down her neck. She let it. Around her, the other women followed her lead, straightening despite exhaustion. Faces lifted. Harris felt it too, the air changing, the roles reversing. His outstretched hand wavered, slowly lowering. These weren't beaten prisoners anymore. They were survivors turning their punishment into a vow. She didn't move. One guard wrote later. She looked through us, not at us, like she saw something we couldn't. Harris wanted to shout, to break the spell, but couldn't. His voice failed. The storm swallowed every sound except the pounding of rain. Time lost meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. Yumi's world had narrowed to one goal: stay upright, unblinking. This wasn't about orders anymore. It was about identity. The Emperor wasn't watching. No one would ever know, but she would. She'd know she didn't fall. She didn't blink. Behind Harris, Sergeant Cole whispered, "Sir, let her stop." But Harris didn't answer. He couldn't. He was watching something sacred, an enemy's soul refusing to die. And then, with the next crack of thunder, Harris took one step closer, unable to look away. He didn't know it yet, but what came next would break them both. The thunder rolled across the camp like a warning shot. The rain had softened into a steady curtain now, but the damage was already done. Lieutenant Harris stood frozen in front of Yumi, his breath shallow, heart hammering under his soaked jacket. Behind him, Sergeant Cole was shouting something to the medics, his voice muffled by the hiss of water. One of the women finally dropped, knees hitting the mud, body shaking uncontrollably. Then another followed. The line trembled as the human limits of endurance started to crack. 2 hours had passed since Harris first stepped out into the storm. 4 in total, since the punishment began. Body temperature below 30, 4 degrees Celsius meant clinical hypothermia. Half the women were already there. Cole sprinted toward the collapsed figures, waving for stretchers. Harris still hadn't spoken. His eyes were locked on Yumi, who was swaying now, her gaze unfocused but still defiantly open. "She won't stop," Cole yelled, grabbing Harris's arm. "If we don't pull her, she'll die on her feet." That word, die, snapped something in Harris. He pushed through the rain, caught Yumi by the shoulders, and shouted, "Enough." "That's an order." Her knees buckled, but even as she fell into his arms, her eyelids never fully closed. They carried the women inside one by one, wrapped in soaked blankets. The barracks smelled of diesel, iodine, and wet fabric. The medics' flashlights flickered across pale faces and trembling hands. Harris stood in the doorway, drenched, guilt burning through him like fever. This wasn't a victory. It was a mirror held too close. Yumi's pulse was faint, her lips blue. A medic read out her temperature, barely 33 degrees. "She needs warmth fast," someone said. Harris nodded, voice low, almost to himself. "Get every blanket we've got." For the first time all night, the rain outside didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like penance. Cole glanced at Harris. "Sir, we done." Harris exhaled. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're done." But Yumi wasn't. Even unconscious, her eyelids twitched as if still fighting to stay open. Her body was broken, but her will hadn't bent. And as the door shut on the storm outside, her lips parted just enough to whisper something the medic couldn't understand. Inside the infirmary, she would finally speak. The barracks were silent, except for the low hum of a generator and the drip of rain from the ceiling. The air smelled of iodine, canvas, and wet wool. Yumi Takahashi lay on a stretcher near the far wall, eyes half open, body trembling under a pile of rough army blankets. Steam rose from a metal pot of hot water beside her. A medic dabbed her forehead, whispering to another soldier, "She's still fighting it." Across the room, Lieutenant Harris leaned against a support beam, exhausted, his uniform dark with rain and regret. He had seen death before, but not like this. Not slow, quiet, and voluntary. The other women lay motionless on cots, faces pale, lips cracked. For most of them, it was the first warmth they'd felt in hours. The nurse tending to Yumi pressed a canteen to her mouth. Yumi's lips moved, barely audible. "Why help us?" The medic froze. Harris heard it too. He walked over, crouched beside her, unsure what to say. His voice came out softer than he expected. "Because you're human," he said. Her eyes flickered confusion, disbelief, maybe anger. "You treat us," she whispered, pausing for breath, "better than our officers." The words hit him harder than any bullet he'd faced in the Pacific. He had read reports Japanese POW often expected execution, not care. They'd been told Americans were monsters, incapable of mercy. Yet here she was, alive because of the same hands she'd been taught to hate. Harris felt something twist inside him, something between guilt and awe. Yumi's breathing steadied. The color began to return to her cheeks. Around them, the rain continued tapping the tin roof, steady and calm now, like a metronome counting the seconds after violence. Cole entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "She gonna make it?" he asked. Harris nodded. "Yeah, but I'm not sure we will." He turned to the window. Outside, the yard was empty. Mud, puddles, silence. The storm had finally broken. Harris realized he didn't fear the enemy anymore. He feared what the war had turned them into. Behind him, Yumi's voice, faint but steady, "When the rain stops, I'll stand again." Harris looked back, eyes heavy. "Then I'll be there," he said quietly. The next morning the rain returned, and so did she. The next morning came gray and quiet, the kind of silence that only follows a storm. The camp was still dripping, gutters overflowing, puddles reflecting the torn clouds above. No orders had been given yet. The guards moved slower, voices low, as if afraid to disturb something fragile left in the air. In the center of the yard stood Yumi Takahashi. Her uniform was still damp, her frame thinner now, but her stance steady. She wasn't told to go there. She chose to. Lieutenant Harris watched from the steps of the barrack, a tin cup of cold coffee in his hands. He didn't call out. He knew this wasn't defiance anymore. It was ritual, a way to reclaim something that the night had taken. The other women slowly emerged, one by one, until a small line formed behind her. No guards shouted, no whistles blew. The rain started again, soft at first, then steady. This time, no one moved to stop it. Reports indicate that by early 1946, over 400 Japanese women POW were repatriated from Pacific camps. Most never spoke publicly of what they endured. Some carried scars, others carried silence. But that morning in Okinawa, before the transfers began, they stood together in the rain one last time, not as prisoners, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. Harris stepped off the porch, boots splashing in the shallow water. He stopped a few feet away, hat in hand. The rain soaked them both equally now. No ranks, no sides. Yumi looked up, eyes blinking naturally for the first time. He met her gaze, and for a second it wasn't war. It was understanding. Cole joined him, muttering under his breath, "Never thought rain could teach a man anything." Harris half smiled, but his eyes stayed on Yumi. "It teaches patience," he said quietly, "and the cost of pride." The sound of the rain filled the gaps between them, washing away orders, guilt, and fear. For once, no one kept score. The war would end, the files would close, and the photos would fade. But some moments never filed away. They linger like rain that refuses to stop. Yumi closed her eyes at last, a small motion that meant everything. She had blinked, but she hadn't bowed.